Welcome to Retro Reads, where timeless mysteries come to life. Today, a new case awaits, full of twists, secrets, and thrilling revelations. Settle in, relax, and let the adventure begin. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and at what time. Let's get started and dive into this unforgettable story. There are few sounds more unnerving than Fritz Brenner rattling cookware before 9 in the morning. Normally, the kitchen at the Brownstone operates with the sanctity of a monastery, silent, precise, and devout. But that morning, the symphony was offbeat. There was a clatter of copper pots, an audible sigh, and at one point, a muffled German oath that I'll refrain from repeating, though it was vivid enough to blister the varnish on the pantry door. I was seated in the office, catching up on the mail, which in my case meant sorting the wheat from the inevitable crop of lunatics who thought Nero Wolfe would take on a case for $5 and a mention in their will. Wolfe himself was nowhere to be seen, naturally. It was the sacred hour of orchid worship, and short of an earthquake or a constitutional crisis, nothing breached the sanctum upstairs. But Fritz's mood had weight, and that weight had heft enough to reach even Wolfe's rarefied air. At 9:32 sharp, the elevator groaned, and the man himself descended, massive, composed, and mildly annoyed, which is how he looks on a good day. He did not speak at first, merely cast a glance in the direction of the kitchen. I was about to offer a witty observation on the state of culinary unrest when the doorbell rang. Wolfe paused. "Pfui," he said quietly. That was when I knew it was going to be one of those days. The man standing on our stoop was overdressed for desperation, pinstripe suit, lemon pocket square, and a hat that cost more than most people's rent. He looked like a man who dined where menus had no prices. But the eyes gave him away. They darted, they pleaded, they screamed. "I don't have an appointment," he admitted, "but I'm in serious danger, please." That sort of thing is usually my cue to dismiss a person gently and guide them toward the nearest police precinct. But before I could deliver my usual patter, Fritz appeared at my side, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked at the man, then at me, then, uncharacteristically, spoke. "Archie, bring him in. Mr. Wolfe must see him." That's when I knew we were off the map. Fritz never orders, he requests, he suggests, but this was a command in all but name. Wolfe, now seated and sipping his first bottle of beer, barely glanced up as the guest entered. "My name is Anthony Belvedere," the man said. "I'm a pastry chef, consultant actually, former head pâtissier at Le Marais on Lexington. I believe someone wants to kill me." Wolfe exhaled slowly. "Indeed." "Mr. Goodwin, remove this gentleman. I have no interest in trifles." "It's not a trifle," Belvedere snapped. "It's an eclair, or rather a box of them, delivered to my apartment yesterday. I ate one. I'm lucky I didn't eat two." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, slightly. "You consumed a poisoned pastry?" "I had it tested this morning. Ricin. Someone wants me out of the picture." At that, Fritz stepped into the room again, silent, eyes fixed on Wolfe. And Wolfe, to my everlasting astonishment, said, "Sit, Mr. Belvedere. You have 5 minutes." Wolfe's tolerance for uninvited guests is approximately nil, and his patience for pastry chefs who claim someone slipped them a side of ricin is only marginally greater. But Fritz's posture spoke volumes. He stood by the door, arms folded, his brows knit together in a way that was more than irritation. It was unease. Wolfe regarded him for a long moment, then said with pointed slowness, "If you intend to hover, Fritz, kindly explain your purpose." "He is, how do you say, a true artist," Fritz muttered. "I know his work. I have made his Torta Regina from his notes. It is perfect. He's not a liar." This, from Fritz, was the culinary equivalent of swearing on the Bible. Wolfe sighed, the kind of sigh that suggested a prayer for strength. "Very well," he said. "Mr. Belvedere, begin at the beginning." Belvedere nodded, still seated on the edge of the red leather chair, as though he might be ejected at any moment. "It started last month. I created a new dessert, a variation on a southern Italian cassata. I tested it at a private event. The response was overwhelming. Soon after, I received a note, anonymous. It offered $50,000 for exclusive rights to the recipe. I declined. Wolfe tilted his head slightly. You declined $50,000 for flour and sugar? It wasn't about money, Belvedere said. It was mine. I don't sell my integrity. Fritz made a small, approving sound in his throat. Wolfe, ignoring him, merely muttered, Integrity is admirable. Suicide is not. Continue. The next day, Belvedere continued, a courier left a box at my door. I assumed it was from one of the attendees. Gratitude, perhaps. But I opened it and found a dozen eclairs all lined up like soldiers. I took one bite. It tasted wrong, bitter, slightly metallic. I spit it out, felt dizzy, and called a friend at a lab. He ran tests. Wolfe drummed his fingers on the armrest. You kept the box? I brought it with me. He opened his briefcase and carefully set the pristine white pastry box on Wolfe's desk. Wolfe did not touch it. He merely looked at me. Archie, you will deliver this to Lon Cohen's contact at the Department of Health. Already ahead of you, I said. I made a call when he was in the foyer. I figured any story involving poisoned baked goods deserved a second opinion. Wolfe grunted. Fritz stepped forward, eyeing the eclairs with something approaching sorrow. And the recipe? Wolfe asked. Is it written down? In my head, nowhere else. A valuable head, then, Wolfe said, and an endangered one. Pfui, Mr. Goodwin, we are engaged. The weight in Fritz's shoulders eased. Wolfe leaned back. And I find I've lost my appetite. Belvedere's apartment was one of those fashionable pre-war things with crown mouldings and credenzas no one used anymore. It smelled faintly of espresso and ambition, with just a trace of perfume that had long since outlived the woman who wore it. I did my usual pass through his kitchen, neat, too neat, and took a look at the box of eclairs that had allegedly tried to punch his ticket. There were only 10 left. 2 were missing. One, he claimed, he'd bitten and spit out. The other, according to him, had been tested at the lab. He had them stored in the refrigerator, wrapped in cellophane like museum pieces. And that's where things began to smell, not just literally, but logically. Eclairs, in case you're not up to date on pastry preservation, aren't designed to be refrigerated. The shoe shell goes soggy, the custard turns rubbery, and the whole thing becomes less a dessert and more a rubber truncheon with sugar on top. Which meant either Belvedere didn't know the first thing about storing pastries, a thought that would have sent Fritz into cardiac arrest, or he hadn't intended to eat them. Or perhaps, just perhaps, someone else hadn't intended him to. I checked the trash. Clean. Not a crumb out of place. No wrappers, no smudges, no evidence the box had been tampered with or examined in a hurry. That, in itself, was odd. Even odder, the refrigerator's temperature was too low, not a little too low. Icebox cold. I don't mean to bore you with degrees Fahrenheit, but let's say if you left whipped cream in there, you'd come back to an Arctic brick. Back at the brownstone, I relayed all this to Wolfe, who didn't even grunt. He merely turned a page of his book and said, "Interesting." Which, coming from Wolfe, is the equivalent of a standing ovation. If you want to get the truth out of a pastry chef, never ask them directly. Flatter their palate, question their ratios, then casually imply someone else may have done it better. You'll get more honesty out of their ego than from any oath. So I made my way through Manhattan's upper-crust dessert joints with the casual curiosity of a man searching for a good cannoli and maybe a killer. First stop, Pavoni and Sons, an old-school Neapolitan bakery where the sugar was as thick as the accents. I asked about Belvedere. They respected him grudgingly, called him too modern, which in pastry terms is equivalent to blasphemous. Next was Chérie Pâtisserie, all glass counters and delicate frills. The manager there had nothing bad to say because she had nothing at all to say. A practiced void of an answer. That's how you know someone's heard rumors they don't want to repeat. Then there was Dolcissimo, a sleek, aggressively French bistro in Tribeca. Their head chef, a wiry man named Alain with knives for cheekbones, dismissed Belvedere as overrated and overhyped. He said Belvedere had burned bridges and ruffled feathers, though he said it with the elegance of someone spreading whipped ganache. "Did you hear about the recipe?" I asked, as though it were gossip over mimosas. He paused. "The cassata variant? Yes, everyone's heard. There's a rumor he based it on a stolen Sicilian formula. But chefs like to invent myths. It gives their food a soul." That told me two things. First, the recipe was real and known. Second, it was valuable enough for people to lie about. On my way out, Alain said he doesn't deserve to die over it, but then again, what chef does? I filed that under creepy philosophical notes and called Wolfe. His response keeps stirring. Carmela DuPont lived in a downtown loft that smelled of vanilla, ambition, and faint resentment. She met me at the door in a chef's coat and diamond earrings, as if she'd been expecting a photo shoot and got me instead. "You're from the press?" she asked. "Not quite. I'm from the private sector." Even worse. She let me in anyway, which was the first surprise. The second was how quickly she started talking once the topic turned to Belvedere. "I've known Anthony for 12 years, she said, gesturing toward a wall covered in framed culinary awards. "We were classmates at the academy in Lyon. He's always been dramatic. Brilliant, yes, but theatrical." "You two stay in touch?" I asked. "We've had professional overlap, though not recently." Her tone suggested that overlap might have involved more than fondant and flour, but I didn't pry. I told her about the eclairs. She blinked, then shook her head slowly. "Poison pastries? My God, of course he'd make it theatrical. I suppose next he'll fake his own death with a flaming baked Alaska." "So you don't believe him?" "I didn't say that. Anthony is many things, vain, controlling, obsessed, but not a liar, not about food." "Any enemies?" I asked. "Everyone has enemies in this business. You think restaurateurs play nice?" She gestured toward a trash bin in the corner. I noted discreetly a pastry box not unlike the one Belvedere had shown us. She followed my gaze. "A gift," she said. "Anonymous." I threw it out. I didn't believe her, but I thanked her anyway and made my way back to the car. I called Wolfe and reported. His reply, "She is hiding something. It may not be murder, but it smells of treachery." Coming from Wolfe, that was practically poetic. Lyle Fenton's office smelled like money and sterilized ambition, walnut paneling, smoked glass, and a secretary who wore a headset like a military commandant. Fenton himself had the posture of a man who'd never been told no and hadn't planned to start today. He greeted me with a handshake designed for leverage and a smile polished to boardroom specs. "Mr. Goodwin, yes? I've heard of your employer." "That's funny," I said. "He hasn't heard of you, but give it time." He gestured for me to sit, which I did without complimenting his chair. "I assume this is about Mr. Belvedere," he said too quickly. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to. I've already been contacted by the press, rumors, idiotic ones. Someone thinks I'm trying to poison a chef over a dessert." "Well," I said, "when the dessert's worth 50 grand, it's less idiotic and more mildly plausible." Fenton gave a dismissive wave. "We offered him money for exclusivity, yes. Common practice in culinary consulting. I make deals. I don't lace eclairs with biotoxins." He leaned back and tapped a Mont Blanc against his knuckles. "Frankly, I think he's orchestrating this whole thing to inflate his value, create mystique, the pastry under siege narrative, its marketing brilliance, if he survives it." "You've got a driver named Lou Skerritt," I said. "Know if he's moonlighting as a food critic? He's been seen chatting up folks in the pastry scene." That got a flicker, nothing more. "Lou has his own life," Fenton said smoothly. "If he's been asking questions, it's because he likes gossip. I don't control his dinner conversations." "Do you know a man named Callahan?" "No." Too quick again. "Sure." "I don't know him," he said firmly. "And if this is going anywhere near litigation, speak to my counsel." I smiled. I'm not litigious. I'm nosy. Whole different energy. Wolfe, when I called him later, listened and said, "A corporate man with lies in his mouth and perfume on his conscience. Continue." Which I did. The Madeleine Post Culinary Academy occupied a bright, overpriced corner of Soho where earnest 20-somethings paid small fortunes to be scolded by retired sous chefs. I dropped in unannounced, which was a faux pas in educational settings but practically protocol in ours. She met me in a glass-walled office that overlooked a kitchen full of clumsy attempts at meringue. Madeleine Post was striking in the precise way you'd expect of someone who used to date a man like Belvedere. Cool, composed, and likely to reduce you to garnish, if provoked. "I haven't spoken to Anthony in over a year," she said. "That's so?" I replied. "Funny, I've got it on good authority. He's still quoting your almond croissant in interviews." She exhaled through her nose, part amusement, part fatigue. "Anthony is the kind of man who collects admiration like rare china. He rotates it seasonally. Do you believe someone's trying to kill him?" She paused, which was the real tell. People who don't believe something say so immediately. "I don't know," she said. "But I wouldn't put it past him to orchestrate something dramatic. Anthony always believed danger added flavor." "Did he share his cassata variation with you?" "No," she said, too quickly. "It was his baby." "You sure about that?" Madeleine folded her arms. "What are you implying?" "Nothing yet. But I did hear a rumor that you two shared more than flour." She didn't blink. "Anthony used to say we were two halves of a perfect dessert. He the vision, I the precision. But that was before he wanted the whole plate to himself." I asked if she'd received anything suspicious recently. She said no, but her assistant later admitted a strange box of macarons had arrived 3 days prior. Madeleine hadn't eaten them. Said she didn't trust unsolicited sugar. Wolfe, when I told him, said, "She's lying, but the reason may be romantic rather than homicidal," which didn't mean it was irrelevant. My next stop was less glamorous, a stop at a downtown notary's office where one of Belvedere's former assistants worked weekends. I'd tracked the guy down through a contact in the restaurant supply business where secrets leak faster than soufflés fall. The man was nervous, but not enough to keep his mouth shut. He confirmed that Belvedere had drafted, but never signed, a contract that promised exclusive rights to the recipe for a cool 50 grand. The buyer was unnamed. The contract had been typed, printed, and folded into a red envelope. He'd seen it on Belvedere's desk. A week later, it vanished. I asked if Belvedere had said who it was for. He hadn't. But he had made a comment that stuck in the assistant's mind. "It's not about the money, it's about control." That line had Wolfe's fingerprints all over it, philosophically speaking. The assistant also mentioned something else, a receipt for a P.O. box rental in Staten Island, paid in cash. I thanked him and took the copy. Back at the brownstone, I laid out the paper trail. Wolfe skimmed it with a sour expression. A contract unsigned, a buyer unnamed, and a box of poison pastries perfectly preserved. Bah, either this man is a master dramatist or someone is layering deceit with precision. He sipped his beer, set it down and said, "We are not at the bottom of this cake, Archie." Not yet. So I kept digging. I've never made a habit of rummaging through people's trash. It's messy work and often yields more banana peels than bullets. But something about Carmela Dupont had been gnawing at me, and it wasn't the lavender ganache she offered during our last visit. So I paid a quiet return call that afternoon, sans doorbell and social grace, and made my way to the alley beside her building, where the tenants deposited their culinary refuse in a row of immaculately labelled bins. I was half expecting decaying croissants and stiletto heels, but instead what I found made my eyebrows rise and stay there. There it was, tucked beneath a pile of wax paper and yesterday's truffle wrappers, a pastry box. White, pristine, identical in dimension, and ribbon to the one Belvedere had delivered to Wolfe. I pulled it out, careful not to get almond cream on my sleeve. The label had been torn off, but I recognized the style, little gold embossing minimalist script. It matched Belvedere's. And more to the point, it still had traces of sugar dust on the base, sugar of the powdered persuasion, mixed faintly with something chalkier. I bagged it, yes, we do carry bags, and rang up Wolfe from a payphone down the street. His voice came low and irritable. Yes? Carmela's trash is full of surprises, I said. Identical box, same brand, same ribbon, empty but suspicious. Any explanation? None offered. I didn't ask. She doesn't know I found it. He paused. Then don't tell her, yet. She may come to tell us, if we wait long enough. Which, with Wolfe, was not advice. It was strategy. I returned to the brownstone feeling the case had shifted. Not much, but enough to smell something more deliberate than coincidence. What it meant wasn't yet clear. But pastry boxes don't walk themselves to the trash. Back at the brownstone, I found Fritz in the kitchen, preparing some preposterously delicate appetizer involving quail eggs and roasted fig. Normally, I'd make a crack, but the man's expression kept my wisecracks holstered. Fritz is not what you'd call emotive. He shows his feelings through the firmness of a whisk or the angle of a parsley sprig. But that afternoon, he looked older, creased around the eyes, his movements just a shade slower. Still think Belvedere is innocent? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Just stirred something simmering on the stove, his back to me. Then, I think he is proud, he said. And pride, when it is wounded, does strange things. Strange like lying about threats, strange like hiring a thug to stir up drama. Fritz turned then, calm but firm. You think this is theatre? I think it might be a production, I replied. And if it is, we've been cast in supporting roles. He returned to his stirring. Anthony is capable of arrogance, but not poison, not death. He reveres the art too much. I didn't press him further. Fritz's loyalty was deep-rooted, more admiration than friendship, maybe, but no less potent. Still, admiration could be blinding. Upstairs, Wolfe was in his chair, rereading a monograph on caper buds. He will defend that man until he cannot, Wolfe said, not looking up. You don't trust Belvedere either? I asked. I trust no one whose livelihood depends on the illusion of purity, Wolfe replied. And with that, he sipped his beer. The call came just after breakfast, when Wolfe was elbow-deep in his orchids, and I was elbow-deep in the latest headlines. None of them were edible until Lon Cohen rang with a bite of something both sweet and sour. You heard of Leo Callahan? He asked. Name rings a bell, big guy, limited vocabulary, occasionally dabbles in extortion. That's the one. He was found dead this morning in a midtown hotel, face down in a box of cannoli. Heart attack? Try poison. The lab boys are buzzing. It was a curious twist. Callahan wasn't the sort to go out whimpering over dessert. I hung up and relayed the news to Wolfe, who had returned from his orchid room with a fresh beer and no appetite for surprises. A coincidence, he muttered. Possibly, I said. Unless someone has a particular grudge against pastry chefs and pastry consumers. By noon, the report confirmed it. Callahan had ingested ricin. Not inhaled, not absorbed, swallowed. Wolfe listened without comment until I added the part about the delivery box. White cardboard, gold script, identical dimensions to Belvedere's. There is no such thing as a coincidence, Mr. Goodwin, he said, only intersecting schemes. That was Wolfe's version of being rattled. I went down to the precinct on 32nd, flashed a few credentials that sounded more official than they were, and got a peek at the photos. It wasn't pretty. Callahan's face was half buried in pastry. The cannoli had been laced, not just dusted, with ricin. Whoever did it knew their way around a pastry bag and a poison chart. Back at the brownstone, I handed Wolfe the report. A second pastry box, he said softly. An echo of the first. Maybe someone's trying to pin Belvedere for a murder he only planned, I suggested. Or someone's cleaning up loose ends, Wolfe said, and using confectionery as camouflage. The lab analysis came in through a friendly pathologist who owed me a favor from a case involving duck liver pâté and a fraudulent will. He confirmed what we guessed. The ricin wasn't sprinkled. It had been piped deliberately and precisely into the center of each cannoli shell. Whoever did it had used a professional-grade pastry bag and enough skill to ensure that the ricin was embedded without disturbing the structure of the dessert. They were filled with care, he told me. It wasn't a rush job. This was someone who knew the culinary arts, and the fatal ones. Wolfe absorbed this with a frown that deepened with every syllable. "A gourmet killer," he said, disgusted. "Pfui." I sat across from him and laid out the possibilities. Either someone is staging a culinary killing spree with Belvedere's name attached, or someone from Belvedere's past has moved from sabotage to spectacle. Either way, we've got poison in eclairs and cannoli, and now a corpse. Wolfe didn't respond immediately. He tapped the rim of his beer bottle 3 times, his version of deep thought. "Ricin," he murmured. "Not an amateur's choice, difficult to procure, harder to dose correctly, and yet it has appeared twice in desserts tailored for men with known appetites." "Meaning?" I asked. "Meaning," he said, "that whoever delivered those desserts didn't just know chemistry, they knew cravings, which, if you know Wolfe, was more damning than a smoking gun." "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "fetch Mr. Panzer," which meant things had officially passed from curiosity to chessboard. Saul Panzer arrived that evening, quiet as fog, dressed like a man who could vanish into a crowd or a wine cellar without wrinkling his collar. I gave him the rundown, sparing no pastry detail, and Wolfe handed him a list of names. Chief among them, Lyle Fenton's driver, one Louis Skerritt, last seen idling outside a pastry expo 2 days before Callahan's death. Within 24 hours, Saul had more than crumbs. "I tailed Skerritt to a cafe in Murray Hill," Saul said, standing in Wolfe's office with a manila envelope tucked under his arm. "He met with a woman who teaches at Madeline Post School, culinary chemist. They were discussing sugar substitutes, unusual ones, medical-grade xylitol, erythritol, and a rare variant used in European diabetic pastries. Then he passed her an envelope. Wolfe nodded once. "Go on." Callahan was spotted in the same cafe 3 days before that, speaking to Skerritt. Same table, no food ordered. They weren't there for the cannoli. Wolfe leaned back, eyes narrowed. "And you're certain?" "I saw the surveillance photo." Saul handed over the print. Skerritt was their middleman. Wolfe examined the image, then said, "He was hired to make a transaction. Possibly the purchase of a recipe, possibly the delivery of a warning." "Callahan as the messenger?" I asked. "More likely the muscle," Saul said. "But if he got too curious or greedy—" "He was silenced with his own temptation," Wolfe finished, which was the most eloquent summary of death by dessert I'd ever heard. Fritz stepped into the room just then with a tray of brandy and small almond tarts. None of us touched them. Wolfe looked at me. "We are nearing the oven's heat, Archie. Keep your fingers clear." And just like that, things began to bake. Saul Panzer doesn't usually editorialize. He delivers facts, not flavor. But when he handed Wolfe the thin dossier he'd compiled on Leo Callahan, he allowed himself one raised eyebrow and the faintest twist of a smile. "You're not going to believe this," he said. Wolfe, who believed almost nothing without evidence, took the file without comment. I leaned in over his shoulder, since reading upside down is one of my lesser vices. According to Saul, Callahan hadn't just been an occasional dessert enthusiast. He was a connoisseur with compulsions. His calendar was full of culinary events, underground pastry tastings in Brooklyn, sugar sculpture contests in Jersey, and a seminar in Queens titled The Molecular Aesthetics of Ganache. He had a real obsession, Saul said. Not just eating. He liked watching it made, took notes, asked questions. I found 3 pastry chefs who said he was a regular, always under a different name. But they remembered the same thing. He never tipped, and he always asked too much. Wolfe said, Curiosity without context is either intelligence or instability. Could be both, I said. One of the chefs, Saul noted, remembered Callahan asking about toxin resistance, specifically whether there were flavors that could mask bitterness. Another remembered him slipping into the kitchen and sniffing the pastry tubes. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but he set the dossier down as though it had begun to emit heat. Callahan may have been a killer, he said, but someone recognized his weakness and fed it back to him, laced with poison. A man undone by his appetite, I said. No, Mr. Goodwin, Wolfe replied. A man baited by it. There is a difference. It was a fair distinction. Either way, someone had used Callahan's obsession not just to silence him, but to teach a lesson. The question was, who'd written the recipe? The thing about pastry is it leaves a trail, powdered sugar, sticky glazes, and if you're lucky, fingerprints on stainless steel. And when you've got a chef's kitchen that looks like a showroom, even a smudge out of place can be the smoking gun. I paid another visit to Belvedere's apartment, this time with a quiet request from Wolfe to examine more closely. I brought gloves, a small kit borrowed from a friendly technician at the lab, and a mind wide open to deception. Belvedere wasn't home, which helped. I let myself in using a key I may or may not have been supposed to have, and began to explore the countertops. Nothing screamed foul play until I got to the marble island near the copper sink. There, just along the base of a pastry board, I found it, a partial print in what looked like smudged cornstarch. I lifted it, tagged it, and called it in. The match came 2 hours later, Leo Callahan, which meant Belvedere's claim that he didn't know Callahan wasn't just unconvincing, it was false. I called Wolfe. He said nothing for a long moment, then, "That is inconvenient." "For him?" "Want to confront him?" I asked. "Not yet. Let him lie again. It clarifies motive." I relayed the update to Saul. He said, "So Callahan was in the kitchen. That doesn't mean he was invited." "True," I said. "But people don't break in to admire a man's pastry board. Unless they're threatening the chef over a recipe," Saul added. That's when it clicked. Callahan hadn't come for dessert. He'd come for leverage. Which, in this business, is usually the appetizer before murder. Later that evening, Wolfe summoned Fritz, not to the kitchen but to the office. That alone was unusual enough to cause pause. Fritz arrived with his apron neatly folded over one arm, a look of quiet curiosity on his face. Wolfe didn't bother with pleasantries. "You've said you admired Belvedere's work," Wolfe began. "How long have you known of him?" Fritz answered carefully. "Since 2011. We met briefly in Florence. He was staying at the Grand Hotel Baglioni. I was attending a truffle symposium." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "And did you know then of a man travelling with him? Tall, broad, American?" Fritz's forehead furrowed. "Yes, not a chef. He wore suits, often waited in the lobby. He called Belvedere Tony." Wolfe tapped his fingertips together. "Would you recognize him?" Fritz nodded slowly. "I saw the newspaper photo. It was him, Callahan." That did it. A thread pulled taut from Italy to New York. From a truffle conference to a poisoned pastry box, from admiration to deception. Wolfe looked at me. "Archie, Mr. Belvedere's claim that he never met Callahan is now demonstrably false, by witness, by fingerprint, and by photograph. If we invite him here again, do not let him leave without explanation." "Understood." Fritz didn't say another word. He simply turned and left the room, a trace of betrayal lingering in the space he vacated. For Wolfe, the case had ripened, and for Fritz, something far more delicate had begun to spoil. I gave Madeline Post the courtesy of advance notice before dropping by again. It wasn't out of professional obligation. It was to ensure she didn't have time to flee or concoct a souffle of excuses too airy to hold their shape. She met me in her office at the culinary school, looking impeccable, with just the right amount of weariness at being bothered. I respected the performance. "I told you everything last time," she said. "Sure," I said. except for the part where you had lunch with Belvedere 4 days ago." She blinked. It was a subtle thing, but it told a full story. "That's not true." "It is," I said. "You were seen with him at La Tazza Bianca. You had risotto. He had the sea bass. You left before dessert. Odd for a pastry chef and his former flame." "I don't recall that," she said. "Funny how people forget fish." She narrowed her eyes. "What do you want from me?" "Honesty, preferably before the ricin hits a third plate." Her facade cracked, just slightly. "Anthony told me someone was threatening him. That's why we met. He said I was the only one who could help him because I knew how he thought." "And how does he think?" I asked. "Like a man who's been ignored too long," she said. "He needs admiration. He needs a stage. If someone stole his spotlight—" She didn't finish the sentence, but it lingered in the room like burnt caramel. "Did you help him?" "I listened," she said. "That's all?" Back at the brownstone, I relayed the update. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "She lied reflexively," he muttered. "That is either habit or guilt." "And either one is useful," I said. He nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Goodwin." For Wolfe, displeasure doesn't come in tantrums or tantrums in waiting. It arrives as silence, a deeper, more cavernous kind of quiet that makes you check whether you've spoken aloud or merely thought too loudly. The day after I returned from Madeline's tap dance around the truth, Wolfe remained in his chair for nearly 3 hours, saying nothing. He didn't eat lunch. Fritz nearly fainted. He didn't read. He stared at nothing. Occasionally he muttered, but only in Latin, and only phrases that suggested moral nausea. When I couldn't take the stillness anymore, I dropped the full dossier on Belvedere's timeline onto his desk. Wolfe flicked through it, his lips curled slightly downward. "This is a performance," he said. "Whose?" "Everyone's." He tapped the column listing Callahan's movements, then circled back to the copy of the unsigned $50,000 contract. Then, without warning, he muttered, "Pride, vanity, and a palate too refined to resist metaphor." I'd learned long ago not to interrupt Wolfe's poetic musings. They meant the machinery was turning. He finally looked at me. "Mr. Goodwin, summon them all. The time has come to serve the truth, preferably warm." "And the venue?" "My office," he said, rising slowly. "And have Fritz prepare the death pastry." That was when I knew. Wolfe wasn't just assembling evidence, he was baking the trap. Convincing 6 suspects to show up at the brownstone under false pretenses isn't as difficult as you'd think. All it takes is the right bait, this time a fabricated invitation to a private culinary salon hosted by Nero Wolfe himself to discuss the future of recipe exclusivity and the ethics of gastronomic copyright. The fact that Wolfe would sooner emigrate to Albania than host such an event was beside the point. The fiction served its purpose. By 6 o'clock, the chairs in Wolfe's office were filled with an ensemble worthy of a lesser operetta. Lyle Fenton arrived first, all charm and cufflinks, followed by Carmela Dupont, whose perfume had the aggressive confidence of someone used to being followed. Madeline Post swept in 5 minutes later with an air of reluctant grace, her assistant trailing behind like punctuation. Anthony Belvedere showed up last, late, as if to assert that timing, like flavor, was his to control. He wore a dark suit and a pinched expression, glancing briefly at Fritz before seating himself with forced elegance. Wolfe, meanwhile, remained in his chair like a judge awaiting pleas. He didn't greet anyone, he didn't stand, he simply allowed the room to ferment. "I'm not sure what this is," Fenton said. "Nor am I," Madeline chimed in, her tone sweet but firm. "You'll learn," Wolfe said calmly. "But first I believe some of you will enjoy watching an artist at work." He gestured to the door. "Enter Fritz." The room hushed, the way even wolves do when they realize they've walked into someone else's den. Fritz nodded once, set down a tray of ingredients, and began arranging his tools like a surgeon preparing for something much more delicate than life or death. As he reached for the flour, Wolfe finally spoke again. Ladies and gentlemen, I present the pastry in question, or rather the one inspired by it. And with that, the true course of the evening began. If Fritz had any qualms about recreating a dessert linked to 2 near deaths and 1 confirmed, he didn't show them. His movements were precise, his silence complete. He measured flour with the confidence of a man who'd never needed to guess a gram in his life. The suspects, our guests, watched with a blend of fascination and nerves. Carmela tilted her head, observing with the envy of a rival. Fenton maintained a neutral expression, though I saw him glance twice at the custard filling. Madeline's brow remained furrowed, as if trying to recall whether she'd ever tasted something quite so damning. And Belvedere? He sat forward, hands clasped, eyes locked on the table. His expression was unreadable, which for him was practically a confession. Fritz worked efficiently. He didn't speak, didn't explain. He simply assembled the eclair, pastry shell, piped filling, delicate dusting of sugar. Wolfe watched with the same intensity he reserved for rare orchids. Finally, he cleared his throat. "What you are witnessing," he said, "is a recreation of the dessert that very nearly killed Mr. Belvedere and very successfully killed Leo Callahan." That earned a few twitches. "I asked Fritz to make it not to endanger anyone," Wolfe continued, "but to illuminate something quite different. Motive." He gestured toward the counter. "Note the filling, custard lightened with a particular sugar substitute, not one available in standard grocers. It is obscure, expensive, and used primarily in experimental diabetic desserts. It has a distinct aftertaste." "Which was masked," I added, "by Belvedere's own signature glaze. The bitter note was buried under citrus and vanilla." Wolfe nodded. "And only someone intimately familiar with both the chemistry and the flavor would know how to disguise a poison in such a confection." There was a silence then, a silence that stretched and threatened to snap. Then Wolfe said, "I will now tell you who did." And no one dared breathe. Once Fritz finished the final flourish, an elegant line of glaze across the eclair's crown, he stepped back like a man concluding a sonata. No applause followed, of course, but the atmosphere shifted, subtly. Wolfe gestured. "I invite you all to partake. Taste, if you like. You will find it quite safe." That was, in itself, bait. Wolfe rarely invites anyone to eat in his presence, let alone offers something made under his direction. The reactions were telling. Carmela DuPont, ever the professional, leaned forward as though about to inspect the pastry for quality control. But she made no move to touch it. Her eyes stayed locked on Belvedere, not the eclair. Fenton declined outright. "I don't eat sweets," he said. Which may have been true, though I'd seen a file on him noting he'd once invested in a luxury chocolate startup. Madeline Post gave a smile, a practiced one, and made a motion toward the eclair, but stopped halfway. "It's beautiful," she said. "I couldn't possibly." Her assistant just stared. Only Belvedere picked up a fork. He didn't eat, just prodded the pastry, as though testing its weight. I made a show of standing by the bookcase, notebook open, but really I was watching hands and eyes. Whispers weren't spoken, but there were glances. Carmela to Madeline, Madeline to Fenton, Fenton to no one. He had shut himself in as if prepping for litigation. Wolfe did not eat, of course. He simply observed. The eclair remained untouched, which was the point. Because this wasn't about the pastry, it was about the fear beneath it, the tension that swells when the truth begins to rise like dough under pressure. I saw it clearest in Belvedere. His show of confidence had a crack in it, barely visible, but there. His hands were still too long on the fork, his breath a shade too shallow. Wolfe noticed. Wolfe always notices. He looked at the pastry, then at Belvedere. "You know," he said evenly, "what makes that particular eclair different from all others?" Belvedere did not reply, which meant Wolfe had him halfway to confession. "I will make this brief," Wolfe said, his voice cool as a cellar and twice as dense. That eclair contains no conventional sugar, no sucrose, no glucose, not even the charmingly overused agave. It contains a compound known as neotrelin. Fenton blinked. Carmela's brow furrowed. Madeline stayed very still. Neotrelin, Wolfe continued, is a sugar substitute developed for experimental therapeutic desserts in certain European clinics. It is not sold commercially. It is bitter in raw form and unstable in heat, unless, of course, handled with skill and precision. But once masked correctly, it becomes a ghost on the palate. Harmless, unless paired with ricin, with which it reacts efficiently. Now they were all paying attention, even Belvedere, especially Belvedere. This ingredient is not available through ordinary pastry channels, Wolfe said. It is sourced through either clinical research labs or, he paused briefly, very discreet pharmaceutical brokers. I supplied the punch, or someone with a background in food chemistry, which left us staring directly at two people, Carmela, whose pastry background was culinary, not scientific, and Madeline Post, who ran a school known for its advanced curriculum in molecular gastronomy. Belvedere shifted in his seat. Neotrelin was found in the cannoli that killed Callahan, Wolfe said, and in trace form on the pastry box delivered to Mr. Belvedere's apartment. Belvedere opened his mouth. Wolfe raised a hand. I am not accusing you of lacing your own dessert with poison. That would be asinine. I am stating that someone used your recipe, your technique, and inserted a compound only a few people in this room would know how to handle. He turned to Madeline. Miss Post, you teach with it. You lecture on masking bitterness in experimental recipes, and yet when asked if you'd seen Belvedere recently, you lied. Wolfe didn't need her answer. He looked again at the eclair. That dessert is a confession, if one knows how to taste it. And with that, we moved from suspicion to revelation. But we weren't done yet. Wolfe never stops until the soufflé falls or rises exactly as planned. Wolfe allowed the silence to ferment a moment longer before turning his gaze on Lyle Fenton. Mr. Fenton, he said, with a chill that could curdle cream, you claimed earlier to have no involvement with this affair beyond an offer to purchase Mr. Belvedere's recipe. Yet your driver, Mr. Lewis Skerritt, was observed in clandestine meetings with both Callahan and Miss Post's colleague, and Mr. Callahan, shortly before his demise, was seen entering your corporate offices under a false name. Fenton shifted in his chair. You're making a great many inferences, Mr. Wolfe. I make deductions, sir, Wolfe replied. You make evasions. Fenton's jaw twitched. Yes, I sent Skerritt to make contact with Belvedere. I wanted the recipe. Exclusivity in cuisine is the next luxury frontier, and his cassata variant had potential, but I never authorized threats or theatrics, and I certainly had no dealings with Callahan. If my driver overstepped, I'll see he's disciplined. Disciplined? I said. The man was chatting with a known hitman 2 days before the guy ended up face down in a cannoli. Fenton's veneer thinned. Look, I make deals. Sometimes I send someone to apply pressure. That's all this was. Business Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. Then you are fortunate that your ambition stopped just short of murder. Fenton leaned back, folding his arms. I didn't kill anyone. No, Wolfe said. You merely turned a key in a lock you didn't know existed. And others walked through the door you opened. That put Fenton in his place, but Wolfe didn't linger, because his eyes were now on the man with the fork. Belvedere, who hadn't moved in 5 minutes. Wolfe's next words struck like a judge's gavel. Now, let us discuss who did. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He never does, but the effect was absolute. Anthony Belvedere, he said, or should I say, Marco Tonetti? Belvedere blinked. What? A name used in Florence, registered under that name at the Grand Hotel Baglioni 6 years ago. Traveling companion, Leo Callahan. Occupation listed as consultant. Nationality, ambiguous. Your passport that year, conveniently, was issued in Monaco. Belvedere's lips parted, but no sound came out. Wolfe continued. You met Callahan in Italy, where he served as both your bodyguard and, I suspect, your fixer. You were already developing your cassata derivative, but lacked capital to commercialize it. When you returned to New York and began building your reputation, you lost touch, until Callahan reappeared with a proposal of his own. Wolfe leaned slightly forward. He would help you manufacture a threat that would garner sympathy, press, and a mythos. Poison declares, anonymous threats, even a culinary hitman narrative, deliciously dark, a story worth selling. No, Belvedere said hoarsely. Yes, Wolfe said firmly. You never intended the poison to kill. The first box was refrigerated, not ideal for ricin. It was performance. But Callahan didn't stay in his lane. He demanded more, money, credit, perhaps even blackmail. So you turned your own scheme against him. The room was silent. You sent him a second box. This time the dosage was exact. You knew his weakness, his obsession with confections, and laced the cannoli accordingly. Lies, Belvedere said, but without conviction. Your prints, I added, are on the interior of the box, and Callahan's are in your kitchen. Madeline Post exhaled softly. Wolfe folded his hands. You staged your own peril, Mr. Belvedere, and in doing so, you committed a murder both premeditated and ironic. Belvedere stood, slowly. You can't prove. No jury is needed, Wolfe said. Mr. Panzer has already alerted the district attorney. They will take it from here. I moved toward Belvedere. He did not resist. I just wanted the world to see what I made, he said. They will, Wolfe replied, but not from a kitchen. As the door closed behind Belvedere, the room held still, like flour suspended in air after a heavy sift. Carmela murmured something in Italian. Fenton looked at his cufflink. Madeline said nothing at all. Wolfe remained seated, of course, but he turned to Fritz. Your recollection, Fritz, was the pivot. Fritz, who had quietly returned to his usual position near the wall, bowed slightly. He introduced himself as Tonetti, yes, but I remembered his hands. They were too careful to belong to a banker. And you remembered the companion? Rude, impatient, ate 5 profiteroles in 2 minutes. Wolfe grunted. Callahan. He turned back to the group. It was a name buried in a conversation 6 years past, but remembered with the clarity of a palate trained to detect deception in the source. It led me to dig. It led to Marco Tonetti. It led to motive. Fritz inclined his head, but I could see the weight in his eyes. Betrayal, especially from someone admired, lands like a knife with a silk handle. Wolfe took a deep breath, then addressed the room. You were all drawn into a fabrication, a plot wrapped in sugar. Some of you enabled it through silence, others through avarice, but only one stirred the pot until it boiled. He reached for his beer. That will be all. The guests departed, slowly, leaving behind only the scent of pastry and the residue of ruined reputations. Fritz lingered. Wolfe, without looking at him, said, It was never about the recipe. I know, Fritz replied, but I believed in it. Wolfe nodded once. That's not a flaw. And just like that, the case was closed, but the aftertaste, like all great confections, lingered. Fritz returned to the kitchen after the last of the guests had gone, but the usual rhythm, the quiet clatter of polished copper, the hiss of something sublime reducing, was absent. I found him standing at the counter, staring at the remaining eclairs. They looked perfect. Golden brown shells, delicate piping, a glaze that could shame Versailles, but no one had touched them. And now no one would. You okay? I asked. He didn't turn. He was extraordinary as a technician. The things he did with citrus. I watched him once balance grapefruit with rosemary so precisely. He stopped. But he used it to lie. I leaned on the counter. You weren't wrong to admire the art, just the artist. He shook his head. I trusted that he was what he claimed, that he lived for excellence, but he lived for attention. There are betrayals that come with shouting and shattered dishes. This one came with silence and wasted pastry. Later, back in the office, Wolfe had resumed his seat. He wasn't eating. The eclairs had been removed, untouched. I mentioned Fritz's state. Wolfe exhaled slowly. He will recover. He is resilient. Still, I said, he caught the detail that broke it open. Wolfe nodded once. He remembered what mattered, not because he sought proof, but because he listens with purpose. His memory is not just precise, it is principled. Coming from Wolfe, that was no mere compliment, that was canonization. He was wounded by it, I said. As are all who believe in ideals, Wolfe replied. He is a man of conviction, Mr. Goodwin, a rarity. We both sat in silence a while. Then Wolfe added softly, "Tell Fritz we will not discuss it further. Let him cook." And that was that. The betrayal had landed. But Fritz, in his quiet, indomitable way, would turn it into flavor. Even bitterness can be baked into something nourishing. If you're looking for flashing sirens and a dramatic reading of Miranda rights, Saul Panzer isn't your man. He prefers exits to entrances, efficiency to theatre. So when it came time to officially close the curtain on Anthony Belvedere, also known, in less savoury circles, as Marco Tonetti, it was no surprise that Saul handled it the way he handles everything else, quietly. With the DA fully briefed, Wolfe had insisted I hand-deliver a report, complete with annotations and footnotes. Saul made the call to a trusted lieutenant in the department, a man who owed him 3 favours and a pair of antique cufflinks. By the time the authorities moved in, Belvedere had been escorted, not dragged, from his penthouse apartment. He didn't resist. Saul told me later that Belvedere had the look of a man whose souffle had fallen and taken the whole kitchen with it. There were no headlines. Wolfe had anticipated that and discouraged press contact. The death of Leo Callahan, whose career had been built on silence and fists, would remain largely unexplored in the morning editions. And the story of the poisoned pastries would be reduced to a culinary curiosity rather than a public scandal. As for Wolfe, he considered the matter resolved once Saul gave a clipped report over the phone. Custody secured. Quietly, clean. Wolfe's only reply was, "Well done," and that from Nero Wolfe was a standing ovation in 2 words. That evening, Fritz prepared a dessert he hadn't made in years. He didn't announce it, didn't write it on a menu, and certainly didn't explain it. He simply appeared with it at dinner, setting the plate in front of Wolfe without flourish. It was a tortadella nonna, a deceptively simple custard tart, laced with pine nuts and lemon zest, dusted with powdered sugar so fine it might have been snow. I'd tasted Fritz's version once before, years ago, during a case involving a forged will and a retired opera singer with a weakness for limoncello. But this one was different. Lighter somehow. Calmer. The kind of dessert that speaks in lowercase letters. Fritz didn't wait for approval. He set the dish, turned, and went back to the kitchen. I watched Wolfe. He stared at it for a moment, then, with the dignity of a man weighing kingdoms, picked up his fork. 1 bite, a pause, a second bite, no comment. But I noted the faintest shift in his expression. For Wolfe, that was practically a grin. "You going to tell him?" I asked. "No," Wolfe said, chewing slowly. "He knows." "You think it was a message?" "Of course," Wolfe replied. "A dessert is a language, and Fritz speaks it fluently." The rest of the meal passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the soft sound of forks on porcelain. The kind of silence you don't fill because it's saying something all its own. I had the feeling that somewhere between pine nuts and custard, forgiveness had been folded in like a final ingredient. And like all great desserts, it lingered long after the plate was empty. Wolfe doesn't compliment. He approves, occasionally. He acknowledges, rarely. But compliments? Never. At least not in the conventional sense. So when he finished the last bite of Fritz's tart, leaned back in his chair, and quietly reached for the small silver bell he uses when summoning Fritz for culinary matters, I took notice. Fritz reappeared, composed as always. Wolfe said nothing. He simply extended the plate, a subtle, unspoken request. Fritz took the dish, returned minutes later with a second slice, and placed it gently on the linen. Still, no words, just the slight incline of Wolfe's head, and then, once Fritz had gone, the return of fork to custard. "That's your second?" I said. Wolfe didn't glance up. "It is." "Making up for lunch?" "No." He took another bite. "I'm merely honouring a masterpiece." I let that hang in the air. For Wolfe, that was the literary equivalent of kneeling in homage. "You ever going to tell him that directly?" "No." "Why not?" "Because he doesn't need it. He already knows." I poured myself a coffee and leaned back. "Sometimes you're almost human." He looked up at me, arching one brow. "Don't be absurd." And with that, we let the evening settle around us, full bellies, quiet hearts, and the lingering taste of something rare. Wolfe had solved the case, Fritz had healed the wound, and I filed it all away like I always do, because in Wolfe's world, justice is best served hot, preferably with a dollop of whipped cream. It was past midnight, the city humming low and lazy outside the brownstone, and Saul, Panzer and I were in Wolfe's office, him in the red chair, me with my heels on the corner of the desk. Between us, a bottle of Remy Martin and 2 short glasses. Wolfe had retired early, having declared, "I have already expended more words today than decency requires," which by his standards meant he'd spoken in full paragraphs. Saul swirled his glass. "You ever seen a man orchestrate his own fame with that much precision?" "Sure," I said. "Actors, politicians, second-rate authors, but not usually chefs." "Belvedere wasn't just building a name," Saul said. "He was building a myth. The tortured genius, hunted for his brilliance. And he nearly pulled it off, would have had it framed in glossy magazines by summer." I took a sip, until Callahan went off recipe. Saul chuckled softly. He should have stuck to butter and flour. We sat there a while, the brandy doing its quiet work. "I'll give him this," I said. The man knew how to stage a performance. The eclairs, the poison, the pathos. It was theatrical. Saul nodded. "And fatal, which is why I stick to bagels." I topped off our glasses. "Well, here's to the kind of fame that doesn't kill you." "To obscurity," Saul said, raising his glass. "To justice," I replied. We drank in silence. Wolfe's office always felt heavier after a case, like the walls remembered. The next morning, Wolfe emerged at 11 sharp, fully dressed and in a mood neither sour nor sweet, just settled. He sat, poured his beer, and stared out the window at nothing. I didn't interrupt. Eventually, he said, "The absurdity of it all. A man dies over a dessert." "It was more than dessert," I offered. "It was ego, control, maybe love." "Pfui." Wolfe waved a hand. "A recipe, a formula of sugar and pride." He was quiet for another moment, then added, "And yet that vanity exposed him." He looked toward the kitchen. Fritz was humming. "I should tell him," Wolfe said. "You won't," I replied. He grunted. "Number, but I will eat well tonight." Which, from Wolfe, was the closest he'd come to an apology and an ode. That evening, we dined well. Fritz served an herbed lamb with chestnut puree, followed by a lavender panna cotta that nearly made me forget I ever doubted humanity. Wolfe took seconds, then thirds. No one mentioned Belvedere or Callahan or the eclair that had nearly become famous for all the wrong reasons. When dessert was cleared and the last bottle of beer was opened, I leaned back, hands behind my head. "You know," I said, "if you ever retire, you should consider publishing your cases in recipe format." Wolfe frowned. "Don't be absurd. Call it the gourmet guillotine. Every chapter ends with a bite and a body." He made a sound I couldn't quite label, disgust or amusement. It was hard to tell. But I had the last word. I always do, because in Wolfe's world, justice is best served hot, preferably with a dollop of whipped cream.